Today we're going to talk about one of the most chilling and crazy cases. No, I did not say hello or anything like that, but hello, you guys. I hope that everything is well with you guys. I know some of you guys are, or most of you guys are true crime lovers, so welcome to my true crime lovers. I'm a lover of true crime as well, but it's very interesting and I love getting into detailed cases. So today I'm going to talk about one. Today we're going to talk about the Chowchilla, which is very bizarre, very crazy, and it stands as one of the most bizarre cases in history. So let's go ahead and get into it. It was July 15, 1976, a warm summer day in Chowchilla, California. Chowchilla, California is a rural, small town surrounded by farmland, known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and its peaceful way of life. But on this day in 1976, it was anything but that. Something happened that will haunt not only this town, but the entire nation. A school bus carrying 26 children and their driver disappeared without a trace. What started as a normal afternoon will become one of the most terrifying and bizarre crimes in American history. A kidnapping took place. So cruel, so calculated, and it still leaves investigators shaking their heads decades later after all of this had happened. This is a story of the Chowchilla Kidnapping. This is where children and their bus driver was buried alive. It was the last day of summer school at Dairyland Elementary in Chowchilla. The kids, ages 5 to 14, were buzzing with excitement. Of course, like anybody would. Summer school is over. Everything is over. We don't have to go to school anymore. But, of course, this day was anything but the ordinary. They had just finished their classes and were ready to head home for the afternoon. They were ready to go swimming. They were ready to, get popsicles and the promise of a nice summer vacation. The school bus was driven by 55-year-old Ed Ray. He began his usual route home around 4 p.m. Ed was well known and well liked in the community. He was known as somebody that was very gentle and a responsible man who had driven the local kids home for years. So many people knew of Ed and they really liked Ed. They really appreciated him. They really took a liking to him very early because of his standpoint in that community. As the bus rolled through the rural back roads, the children laughed and they sang and they just were on the bus like any kid would be around that age, or just in general, just talking, laughing, playing. We're just happy that they were going to be out for the summer. They were completely unaware that within minutes, their ordinary ride would turn into a nightmare. As the bus made its way down Avenue 21, as they would call it, a white van suddenly blocked the road. Ed Ray showed the bus to a stop. He stopped the bus or whatever the case may be. He was thinking that perhaps it was maybe an accident that had happened or anything that had happened. But then 2 masked men armed with guns had stepped out of the van. So at that point, he was frightened. He didn't know what the hell was going on. The men then came up to the bus and they ordered Ed to open the door. Before he or the children could react, a third man in the van appeared behind the bus, cutting off any chance of escape. So basically, they cornered him in. He couldn't move the bus. There was no way of him moving that bus or whatever. Which is very terrifying at that point. And again, I like to say that in situations where there's danger, a person does not know what they're going to do until they're literally in a life or danger type of situation. So again, we give Ed his credit. The 3 men was wearing pantyhose over their faces and armed with shotguns and pistols. They then boarded the bus. They quickly took control. They ordered Ed and the children to move to the back. They were calm, methodical, and disturbingly professional. They drove the bus off the main road and down to a dirt path and into a dry riverbed surrounded by trees. So in this point in time, I knew that everything was very calculated. They knew exactly how they were going to do this. I feel, knew his route home and all types of things. So at this point, I feel like everything was calculated. And I do believe that things were calculated, which it shows. There, the 2 vans were waiting. a dark colored panel van with their windows blacked out. The children and Ed were herded one by one into the back of the vans. They were told to get into the back of those vans. Again, they were stood up by these mass murderers, you get what I'm saying? Their small bodies packed tightly together. They could barely move or even breathe. The kidnappers slammed the door shut and they sealed the van to where no one could get out. Then the convoys began to move. What is convoy? Somebody please let me know that down below. I should know a little bit more about that. When the bus failed to arrive home, panic spread across Chowchilla. The parents were concerned. Everyone in the neighborhood was just concerned because they were used to a certain time that Ed would drop the kids off and things like that. They waited a couple minutes later and still the kids were not present, so they began to get worried. Parents then gathered at the school. They called friends, they called neighbors, and of course they called the police. By nightfall, a massive search was on the way for them. Helicopters, deputies, everything. But there was no sign of the children. They had no clue where the children were. No sign of Ed, no sign of the school bus. No one knew where they were. As the hours passed, fear turned into dread. They began just panicking. They were panicking first. They were panicking at first, but at this point, they were definitely panicking. The kids, it was nightfall. It was nighttime and things like that, and they still had no trace of the kids, Ed, the school bus, anything like that. The search people, the police, the neighborhood, the deputies, nobody could find them. They were definitely worried. They were definitely scared for the lives of the kids and for the life of Ed. For the life of Ed. They were wondering, had there been an accident or had it been something worse? They had no clue. By morning, the FBI was called in. The next day, July 16th, the empty school bus was finally found hidden behind a bamboo thicket near the Chowchilla River. Its windows was covered and its seats was empty, but there was no sign of the 27 missing souls, period. While the search was raged above ground, the victims were enduring unthinkable terror below it. After 11 suffocating hours in the vans, the children and Ed were finally brought to a remote quarry in California, more than 100 miles away from where they were, from where they stayed, from where the schools was, where their homes were, and the neighborhoods. There, deep inside the property owned by one of the kidnappers' families, they were forced into a buried moving truck. The truck had been converted into an underground bunker, if you would like to call it that. Inside were crude mattresses, some food, water jugs, flashlights, and ventilation pipes leading to the surface. The kidnappers had buried the truck under dirt and heavy sheets of steel, leaving their victims trapped underground. The air was thick, hot, and hard to breathe. The children began to panic. Some cried for their parents. Others fainted from exhaustion and fear. And you can just imagine, I don't know if there was, did they say food? Yeah, they did say food was on there and things like that, but you can only imagine being in that, sort of situation. Nobody wants food. They want to go home. They want to be free of this terror. Ed and an older boy that was 14 years old tried to calm everyone down. But as hours passed, food had run low and the ventilation pipes began clogging with dirt. So it was basically like really stuffy in that tight space that everyone was in. The realization had hit them. They felt like they were going to die if they didn't escape. After 16 hours of being underground, Ed and the 14-year-old that was helping him out to keep everybody calm had decided that they couldn't wait any longer. They had to try something. They had to try something to escape this or get the hell out of there. They began stacking mattresses on top of each other, pushing at the steel plate above. The dirt kept falling back in. The air was running out. For hours, they worked in near darkness, using pieces of wood and their bare hands to dig toward the surface. Finally, after more than 16 hours of being buried alive, they broke through the surface. One by one, the children, luckily, thankfully, and everything climbed out. They were exhausted, they were filthy, and they were crying. When they reached the top, They saw only endless hills and dirt, but they were alive. Ed led the group to a nearby guard shack at the quarry. When workers saw the group covered in dirt, crying in tears, they immediately called the police with no question. After 27 hours in captivity, all 27 victims were alive, and thankfully they were. Thank God. Against the odds, they had all escaped their underground grave that the crazy people, the madmen, had set for them. The investigation and the investigators had quickly started to focus on where the victims had been found. That area was owned by the family of Frederick, a 24-year-old man from a wealthy family in California, one of the richest towns in that state. So again, they did this heinous crime, I believe, for money. I had heard in some stories and different things of that nature, I believe, for that sort of thing. But most of those men that did that, or the men that did that, I believe they did come from rich families and rich homes, which, no excuse, rich or not, anything of that heinous nature should not even be thought of. Along with the Woods, police identified two brothers, James and Richard, sons of another affluent Bay Area family. These weren't hardened criminals from the streets. They were privileged young men. Like I said, they were college educated, they came from money, and they had much access to resources. They were really trying to figure out their motive, but the motive was pure greed, as they came down to realizing. They had planned to demand $5 million from the state of California, believing that they could get away with that. But their plan unraveled when phone lines at the police station were jammed with calls about the missing children, preventing their ransom call from ever going through. By the time they regrouped, the victims had already escaped. Within 2 weeks, all three men were arrested. The evidence was there, including personal items, blueprints, and written ransom notes that tied them directly to the crime. The three kidnappers was charged with 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom and 27 counts of false imprisonment. In 1977, they were each sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, over time, their sentences was reduced, and all three men would eventually become eligible for parole. Richard, one of the men that were a part of this heinous crime, was released in 2012. His brother James was released in 2015. And in 2022, after multiple denials, Frederick was granted parole as well. For the survivors, life would never be the same. Many suffer from long-time anxiety, depression, nightmares, and even trust issues. Some even struggle with addictions and things of that nature. You can only imagine what they would suffer from just being a part of this crazy ransom thing that had went on with crazy people. Others spoke of panic attacks when entering small or dark places, but they also were resilient. And Ed, he was the humble bus driver who refused to give up and who became the local hero. Ed passed away in 2012. Many of the children were very, very disheartened by his passing. This still remains one of the largest mass kidnappings in U.S. history. It changed how law enforcement handle and look at cases and look at situations from then on. I hope that you guys were able to take something from this case. Let me know down below in the comments. I definitely have more cases coming. We're going to cover a whole lot more on this channel, so definitely stay tuned.